Last week, we discussed pathways to domestic environmental conflict. This week, we'll look at environmental conflicts in the international arena, focusing on three basic types: territorial conquest, water wars, and maritime disputes. These conflicts are comparatively infrequent when compared to domestic armed conflicts. Between 1816 and 2007, only 95 interstate wars occurred that claimed more than 1,000 lives on the battlefield. Over that same time period, at least 440 intrastate conflicts occurred of similar magnitude. However, while relatively infrequent, interstate wars can be particularly devastating. As with domestic claims over natural resources, international disputes over natural resources are seemingly omnipresent. There are hundreds of active territorial claims, where two countries jointly claim the same territory, and plenty of wrangling over upstream-downstream relationships with respect to shared rivers, such as ongoing but mostly settled dispute over the discharge of chlorides by France, Germany, and Switzerland, the upstream countries, into the Rhine River, adversely affecting the Netherlands, where the Rhine flows into the North Sea. But actual violent conflict over these disputes is not. Why? Well, there are two groups of reasons. The first has to do with salience, how important a given resource is to a particular economy, society, or government. Paul Hensel and co-authors break this concept into tangible salience, such as factors affecting national survival and human and state security, and intangible salience, or factors related to national identity and culture. The Nile is incredibly tangibly salient for Egypt. It supplies 97% of their renewable freshwater. While Canada and the United States may have differences of opinion about how to govern any of the hundreds of small rivers that traverse their borders, none are particularly tangibly salient. They are almost a minuscule, almost imperceptible, tiny fraction of freshwater resources for both countries. Intangible salience is a harder concept to grasp, but rendered pretty straightforward by a clear example. The old city of Jerusalem is less than 1 square kilometer in size. I've actually run the perimeter in about 25 minutes. Has no abundant natural resources and relatively minimal economic activity. It has low tangible salience. But its intangible salience is off of the charts. It's home to 4 of the most holy places for the largest Abrahamic religions: the Temple Mount and Western Wall for Jews, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for Christians, and the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque for Muslims. Its tangible significance is virtually nil. Its intangible significance is incalculably high. So given that many disputes are of relatively low salience, and given that fighting costs blood and treasure, it's simply not worth fighting over many of these disputes. But what about those times when it might be worth fighting over? Still, even in situations where claims have high salience, they most often do not result in conflict. Again, like last week, we can look to contextual factors. In this setting, the economic, political, and institutional relationships between states that make conflict more or less likely. We can refer to those factors as the Kantian tripod. Immanuel Kant was a Prussian-born, German-speaking philosopher who has become one of the most influential figures in modern Western philosophy. Among his many works was 1795's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, in which he outlined 3 conditions that would need to be present in order for a condition of perpetual peace to exist between governments. First, that they be republican, i.e. democratic or representative democratic, in character. 2, commerce and travel of persons between states would be unencumbered. And 3, membership in international institutions, or what he conceived of at the time as a worldwide representative government composed of sovereign states of the world, sort of a progenitor of the League of Nations or the United Nations. His argument was and is much more complex, but boiled down to its essence, it revolves around 3 core principles. First, democratic governments will prefer peace to war because in democracies, the people or their representatives are the ones tasked with the decision to go to war or not. In non-democracies, that decision is made by a leader who does not represent or shoulder the cost of fighting, dying, and taxation. That is, democratic institutions bias democratic leaders towards a preference for peaceful conflict resolution. Second, economic interdependence, in the form of trade and investment between nations, creates economic interest in both countries that would prefer peace to war. Think of it this way. Do firms like Apple and Qualcomm or Texas Instruments and even Wynn Casinos, which generates most of its profits from gamblers in Macau, not Vegas, want an actual shooting war with China? And do the Chinese firms that supply these industrial giants want to lose that business? Finally, membership in international institutions offers states ready-made venues for addressing disputes and pursuing peaceful resolution in public, avoiding the kind of hidden statecraft that was behind many of the worst conflicts of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, individually, the presence of these relations each create incentives to peacefully resolve disputes. Collectively, they make conflict almost unthinkable. How valuable would some territory along the Montana-Saskatchewan border have to be for the United States and Canada, two of the world's closest trading partners, allies, and jointly democratic states? How valuable would that need to be for armed conflict to be worth the cost and risk? What's interesting about fisheries conflicts is that they buck this trend. They are one of the leading causes of disputes between democratic countries. The UK-Iceland cod wars are a clear example of this. Those were even alliance members and fairly close trading partners. All of the elements of the Kantian tripod were present. Even the United States have had at least one armed fisheries dispute in each of the last 5 decades. Why? Well, most of the time, violent conflicts are initiated by armed actors, either a sovereign state's military or rebels perhaps fleeing from one country into the territory of another. Fisheries conflicts buck this trend. Recall how they often tend to get started. A country attempts to enforce a maritime boundary that is not recognized, or at least not obeyed, by a rival country's foreign fishing vessels, usually by boarding or firing upon the foreign vessel. Upon interdiction, boarding, or even sinking of the foreign vessel by the home country's Navy or Coast Guard, the foreign fishing vessels then call on their country's Navy or Coast Guard for protection, precipitating a naval standoff. These conflicts are typically thus initiated by privately owned vessels, rather than by the navies themselves. In these scenarios, the navies of competing powers are brought to the brink of or into active engagement by the actions of third parties, the fishing vessels, they neither command nor control. One seeming exception to this trend is the Chinese Far Ocean fishing fleet, which is heavily subsidized and closely linked to the Chinese government.
China is asserting claims to all the waters and airspace of the South China Sea. And they're doing it not primarily with military or law enforcement vessels. They're doing it with an armed militia that camouflages itself by operating on fishing boats. The maritime militia is really the tip of the spear for China's power projection in the South China Sea. So the South China Sea is the most contested piece of geography on the planet. The largest recent deployment we've seen of this militia has taken place over the last 7 months around Thitu Island, which is occupied by about 100 Filipino civilians and a small military contingent. China has had dozens of these militia boats surrounding the island every day. On a shot from December 20th, what you see is 95 Chinese boats, the heaviest day that we have monitored around this feature. Every one of them are large, none of them broadcasting the signals that they should be to avoid collisions, none of them with nets or other gear in the water, none of them fishing. They just sit there for long periods of time, monitoring and intimidating the Filipinos. It seems clear that China's goal in the South China Sea is to establish effective dominance of all the waters and airspace within what they call the 9-dash line. They don't want to do that by fighting a military conflict with the United States or anybody else. What they want to do is use civilian actors, these paramilitary forces, to effectively control the space, make it impossible for their neighbors to operate, and therefore win without ever having to fight. The U.S. needs to turn away from strictly military responses. The U.S. Navy...
Now let's keep the Kantian tripod in mind when we think about the most famous case of a supposed water war, the Six-Day War between Israel and a coalition of its Arab neighbors. The Jordan River flows from its headwaters in Syria and Lebanon to the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Tiberias, and onto the Dead Sea in the south. Historically, the Jordan River has supplied a large share of both Israel's and Jordan's freshwater. The salience of the Jordan River for Israel increased substantially after Israel began construction in 1949 of the National Water Carrier, a system of aqueducts and reservoirs designed to siphon water from the Sea of Galilee and deliver it to Israel's more arid central and southern regions. These withdrawals would mean less water flowing downstream into Jordan, which at the time controlled both the west and east banks of the Jordan River. Both Jordan and Syria objected. Tensions really flared in 1953 when Syrian artillery fired on an Israeli construction team that had begun construction for the intake of the National Water Carrier in a demilitarized zone established by the end of the 1948 and 1949 Arab-Israeli War. A U.S. brokered agreement over shared use of the water, known as the Johnston Plan, was negotiated in 1955 but ultimately not ratified by Jordan and Syria. In late 1964, Jordan, Syria, and their allies in the Arab League decided to take unilateral action against Israel's withdrawals from the Sea of Galilee and began construction on projects that would divert flow from the Sea of Galilee's headwaters, that is, the rivers flowing from Jordan and Syria that flow into the Sea of Galilee. This would reduce Israel's overall freshwater resources by nearly 10%. Israel responded to this plan with force in 1967, using air power, artillery, and tanks to destroy Syrian earth-moving equipment. These actions were once referenced by Ariel Sharon and would come to be viewed as one of the major proximate causes of the Six-Day War.
Water is the elixir of life. But water allocation can be a deadly affair. In the Middle East, where temperaments mirror the soaring temperatures and prejudices flow freely, the price of water is sometimes paid in blood. After the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, its leaders put their heads together to develop a water plan that would provide desperately needed fluid for drinking and irrigation purposes. Israel came up with the National Water Carrier Project, a plan to draw water from the Kinneret Lake in its north through a technically challenging network of canals, tunnels, and pipes covering a diversity of terrain and elevations, all the way down Israel's west coast to its populated center and to its parched agricultural south. The Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, is a picturesque lake in Israel's north, ringed with beaches, meadows, and mountains. It is approximately 35 miles in circumference and 150 feet at its deepest point. It held enough water to meet the demands of Israel's expanding population for decades. However, this wonderful freshwater asset is inherently fragile. It is fed mainly by the waters of the Jordan River, which originates in the gushing springs and tributaries of mountainous Lebanon and Syria. Two rivers are especially critical to the aqua that courses down the Jordan Valley before flowing into Lake Kinneret: the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria. Without these two rivers, the Jordan's waters would drop dramatically. The Kinneret's water level would also drop, and its remaining freshwater would be irreversibly salinized by the salt springs sitting on its bed. While Israel simply wanted to have a drink, their plan drew the ire of her neighbors. Having failed to eradicate Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, the Arab world swore to at least limit her growth and economic success. Israel's water project threatened to severely undermine that goal. When Israel began construction on the national water carrier in July of 1953, the war over water was set in motion. Hostilities emerged in 3 stages that served as stepping stones towards a full-scale Arab-Israeli conflict. As Israel's tractors bit into soil north of the Kinneret, Syrian artillery units roared into action, bombarding the Israeli construction site. Syria demanded that the United Nations intervene against Israel. The Security Council wished to uphold Israel's right to resume work on its water project, but the Soviets vetoed the resolution. Israel modified its plan, moved its construction site further from Syria's border, and its engineers went back to work. But the dispute was just warming up. Syria and Jordan then colluded to divert the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk would be forced to flow away from Israel and instead supplement the Jordanians' irrigation needs. United States President Eisenhower dispatched Ambassador Eric Johnston to resolve the situation. The result was the 1955 Johnston Plan, a brave attempt at coexistence and water sharing that Israel embraced and that the Arab League unofficially resolved to abide by, at least temporarily. The waves of war were thereby stilled for most of a decade. In 1964, Israel completed the national water carrier. It was 81 miles in length and had taken years to build at the cost of hundreds of millions of Israeli lira. but it was worth every lira. The carrier was capable of funneling an astonishing 19 million gallons of water per hour, an achievement far too great for Israel's Arab neighbors to swallow. The Arab League hastily convened in Cairo. Desperate to wreck Israel's water resource, they devised a reckless plan. The Headwater Diversion Plan called for the reduction of the water carrier's capacity by 35% by diverting its headwaters, both the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banyas in Syria, into the Yarmouk River, deep in Jordanian territory. At the same time, the Arab League clarified that this was not simply a war about liquid, but rather liquidation. Since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. Accordingly, the Arab states have to prepare so that if necessary results are not achieved, collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. Israel warned that the Headwater Diversion Plan would infringe on its sovereign rights. In other words, it would be considered an act of war. The Arabs, however, were not opposed to a war. They launched their project, and the skirmishes began. In 1965, there were 3 high-profile border clashes. The Syrian military attacked Israeli farmers and army patrols, and Israel responded by sending tanks and artillery to destroy the Arab heavy earth-moving machines that were working on the diversion plan. The Arab states eventually abandoned their project, but the war over water inspired them to plot a war of extermination against Israel. Hostilities between Israel and Syria spiraled over the next 2 years, with Syria using the Golan Heights to rain artillery upon unprotected Israeli farms and villages in the plains below. In the first quarter of 1967, there were over 270 border incidents of sabotage and attack directed against Israel. A view of the war to come came on April 7th when Syria fired at Israeli farmers. Israel responded with artillery, and the fight escalated. Israel sent planes against Syrian positions and villages, and in an ensuing aerial dogfight, Israel downed 6 Syrian fighter jets and chased the remainder all the way back to Damascus. Ariel Sharon later observed, "People generally regard June 5, 1967, as the day the Six-Day War began. That is the official date. But in reality, it started 2.5 years earlier, on the day Israel decided to act against the diversion of the Jordan River. In fact, it could be argued
The Six-Day War ended with Israel's occupation of the west bank of the Jordan River, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. Control of the Golan Heights allowed Israel unfettered access to the Sea of Galilee. Today, however, Israel is much less reliant on the Sea of Galilee than in years past. One way to lessen conflict over shared resources is to make them less vital or less salient to national interests. Israel has achieved this in part by investing in desalination plants, facilities that convert salt water into fresh water, which now produce more fresh water than Israel actually consumes. These investments, along with conservation efforts, have radically lessened Israel's dependence on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Six-Day War was the most prominent example that's out there in the literature of a water war. But was water really the primary and unique cause? Would conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors have been likely to occur in the absence of the dispute over the Jordan River? That is, was war overdetermined? Are there more causes present than necessary to reasonably explain the outcome? The concept of overdetermination can get pretty technical in a logical sense, but it's covered nicely by Kumail Nanjiani in this old stand-up bit. Note, he swears a little bit.
Have you guys heard of this new drug called cheese? Like that's this cheese. You've heard of it? No. Okay. It's that's like a street name for it. It's like a new drug cocktail called cheese. And I read like 4 or 5 news reports on it. They were like, "There's this new drug called cheese. It's sweeping the nation. Kids in the Midwest are doing it. It's an epidemic. It's a new drug. It's an epidemic." Then I looked up what cheese is. Cheese is Tylenol PM and heroin. So really, it's heroin. It's mostly heroin. Heroin's doing the heavy lifting in this drug cocktail. It's not a new drug. It's mostly heroin. I can't put heroin on pancakes and go, I have a new drug. I call it shake cakes. You eat them every day. If you stop, you'll get the shakes. Don't forget the special shake sauce. It's maple syrup and heroin. Pour that on there. It's not a new drug, is my point. It's mostly heroin. I think the last new drug was crystal meth, which you had to make in your bathtub. And if you fucked up while you were making it, everything would explode and you would die. That's how dangerous that drug is. Just trying to make it can kill you. And you make it just from shit you get at the store. To make cheese, you still need heroin. Just do the heroin. You already have heroin. Just do the heroin. That's my message to you guys tonight. Just do the
His point? The Tylenol PM didn't really need to be there for the people to be getting high. Similarly, in thinking about the Six-Day War, it's hard to argue water was the only cause of the conflict. A lot of other factors pointed in the direction of war in the first place. The competing claims on the Jordan River may have heightened tensions, but Israel, Jordan, and Syria were already among the most likely cases for interstate conflict. Israel was democratic, confronting non-democratic Jordan and Syria, with extremely limited economic linkages in between them, and a history of past conflict, the Arab-Israeli Wars of 1948 and 1956. Other factors, like Egypt's closing of the Straits of Tiran, a shipping corridor linking Israel's port in Eilat on the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, could also be viewed as triggers as well. So many of the most likely cases for water wars, such as the Six-Day War or conflict over the Indus River between India and Pakistan, are also most likely cases for conflict for reasons that have nothing to do with water. We'll now take a similar look at a crisis unfolding right before our very eyes, the dispute between Egypt and Sudan over the Nile River. How do you think this dispute will unfold? We'll discuss in greater detail in class.
Let's talk about the Nile River and why Egypt and Ethiopia have been fighting over it. The problem is this dam being built in Ethiopia. Once it's finished, it'll be the most powerful hydroelectric dam in Africa.
አገሪቱ በድህነት ላይ ያለች ሀገር ስለሆነች የኤሌክትሪክ ሲስተሙ ለሁሉም ተደራሽ ይሆናል የሚል ሐሳብ አለኝ።
But Egypt says its supply of water is in danger of drying up.
الكل عامة قلقان خراب على الكل.
After years of talks, they're now saying they're close to signing a deal on how to share the water. But there are lots of details that need to be worked out. So why has it been so hard to end the battle for the Nile? Its official name is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it's huge. When they're done building it, the reservoir will be bigger than Greater London and cover almost 1,700 square kilometers.
It's pretty much the largest project the government has ever embarked upon. The original cost of it was around $5 billion. It will probably be significantly more than that.
But before we get into the dispute about the dam itself, it helps to understand the Nile Basin and what's at stake. 11 African countries are in it, and 280 million people live there. The Nile is also, fun fact, the only major river that runs south to north. One of the river's tributaries, the Blue Nile, starts off in Lake Tana in Ethiopia and converges with the White Nile in Sudan's capital, Khartoum. From there, the Nile flows downstream to Egypt. There are several dams along the way, including Egypt's Aswan Dam. But Ethiopia is building its power plant upstream, right here on the border with Sudan. Now, as the name Renaissance suggests, this dam is supposed to revive Ethiopia's economy. It'll provide electricity to millions of Ethiopians. And that's big, because right now more than 2/3 of the population aren't connected to the grid. That's about 75 million people.
Over several years, it will produce 6,000 megawatts. Ethiopia's current generating capacity is only 4,000 megawatts.
So this dam is also going to generate more power for Ethiopia than it needs, meaning it can export electricity. That's all very good news for Ethiopia. But if you ask Egypt, this dam will be catastrophic. The Nile has been at the center of Egyptian life for millennia. An entire ancient civilization was built around it and relied on the river for transport and irrigation. And that's still the case today. The country relies on the Nile for almost all of its water.
It's a rain-starved, largely desert country. So obviously, any potential interruption to the flow of the Nile is justifiably of huge concern for Egypt.
Egypt controls most of the flow of the River Nile into its country, at least for now.
Egypt's biggest worry is how quickly Ethiopia will fill the reservoir, and our colleagues at Al Jazeera Labs have studied a few scenarios. Say Ethiopia agrees to fill the reservoir over the next 10 years. AJ Labs says that would cut Egypt's water supply by 14% and destroy 18% of its farmland. If Ethiopia fills the dam more quickly, say over 7 years, 1/3 of Egypt's farmland would be lost, and a 5-year window would destroy half of that land. According to their simulations, this is how the Egyptian delta would change over those 10 years. So Ethiopia's best case scenario, filling the dam as soon as possible, is Egypt's worst nightmare. It's no wonder these negotiations have been tough. It was during the Arab Spring in 2011, while Egypt had a revolution on its hands, that Ethiopia started building the dam. Ever since then, Egyptian leaders have tried to stop the project, and military conflict never seemed far.
Last year, Ethiopia accused Egypt of sending rebels to neighboring Eritrea to sabotage the dam, prompting another Nile-sharing country, Sudan, to send its troops to its border.
In 2018, the operating manager of the Ethiopian dam, Semenu Bekele, was found dead.
Bekele's sudden death drew crowds and raised suspicions.
It was reported he'd been shot in broad daylight, which led to protests, but in the end, the authorities said Bekele took his own life. In 2019, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed even said no force could stop Ethiopia from building a dam. If there's a need to go to war, we could get millions readied. If some could fire a missile, others could use bombs. This is ultimately an age-old debate about who owns the Nile. In 1929, Egypt signed a treaty with Britain, a colonial power in Africa at the time, that basically guarantees its access to the Nile and gave Egypt a veto over construction projects on the river. But Ethiopia didn't sign that treaty. Then in 1999, all the Nile Basin countries, including Egypt and Ethiopia, signed an agreement on managing water. But that deal was compromised in 2010, when 6 of those countries decided to draw up another treaty. This time, Egypt rejected it because it threatened its historic rights to water.
Egypt's concern that if it moves into a new treaty governing the Nile Basin, then it will be left short of water resources, and also its control over the situation will be massively reduced.
And as far as Sudan goes, it's sort of caught in the middle. Egypt is Sudan's political ally, but the government supports the Renaissance Dam because it'll be a source of affordable energy and it will help regulate flooding.
والنيل الأزرق بالذات متمرد جدا بعد مرات الطوب شايفه ده قبل ما يشيلوه بيكون خلاص غرقوا اليوم.
The good news is that Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan are in talks with one another. The bad news is that they still haven't answered the tough questions. Questions like, when there's a drought, will Ethiopia consider Egypt's needs? And when is a drought a drought? Those conversations will only get tougher because more dams are being planned, populations are growing, and the climate is changing, all of which will make the Nile and the supply of water increasingly worth fighting over.
Finally, let's keep again the Kantian tripod in mind when thinking about the most famous war of territorial conquest of the 20th century, World War II. We'll focus on dynamics in Europe for the sake of brevity. Between 1910 and 1920, Germany lost 13% of its territory and all of its colonies as a result of its defeat in World War I. These losses brought about a decade of incredible hardship in Germany. Under the Weimar Republic, which lasted from 1918 to 1933, Germany experienced hyperinflation and financial turmoil. A brief economic rebound between 1923 and 1929 was cut short by the Great Depression and the collapse of the global trading system that left Germany without markets for its exports and, like many countries at the time, dependent on its own devices for vital natural resources like food and fertilizer. The latter being a pretty scary proposition, as German imports of fertilizer had been embargoed during World War I in an attempt to undermine its will to fight. Into this context steps Adolf Hitler, a proponent of the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. Lebensraum was not Hitler's idea. The idea originated with Friedrich Ratzel, a German geographer who coined the term as an analog for the concept of carrying capacity. The metaphorical concept of the German people being an organism that would expand or contract, i.e. prosper or wither, in direct relation to the amount of habitat or land available to it. That's Lebensraum. But it would ultimately prove to be a powerful idea in the hands of a powerful nationalistic orator like Hitler. It ultimately became the justification for Germany's territorial expansions into the Sudetenland in 1938, its annexation of Austria in 1938, and invasions of Poland in 1939, and finally the Soviet Union in 1941. One can question whether Hitler believed the narrative or simply found it a convenient pretext. However, there is no debating that the idea was very prevalent and popular in Germany at the time. And given the context, a collapse in the global trading system, Germany having left the League of Nations in 1933, and its newly authoritarian government under Hitler, it's unsurprising that eventually, Germany's ambitions would be pursued on the battlefield. This lecture used several examples to examine the contextual factors, in the form of the Kantian tripod, that make international disputes more or less likely to turn violent. Next week, we'll shift focus to looking less at causes and more at the consequences of conflict and natural disasters for human security.